America is drowning in $39 trillion of debt, and you're about to pay for it. Right now, the US spends $1.2 trillion a year just on interest, more than the entire defense budget. But here's the terrifying part. In the next 3 years, $9 trillion in old debt gets refinanced at much higher rates, and interest payments will double to $2 trillion. That's when everything breaks. Your savings, your job, your future, all at risk. In the next 25 minutes, I'll expose exactly how we got here, why it can never be repaid, and the 3 catastrophic options left, and why the government has already chosen the one that destroys your wealth. Watch till the end, because what's coming will change everything. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how America reached $39 trillion in debt, why it is mathematically impossible to repay, why it's accelerating right now, how it destroys economic growth, and most importantly, what this means for you, your savings, your job, and your future when this debt bomb finally detonates. Because make no mistake, this debt cannot be repaid through normal means. The math doesn't work. When governments can't repay debt, they have only 3 options. Default, which destroys credibility. Austerity, which triggers depression. Or inflation, which destroys the currency. And America has already chosen inflation. The printing presses are warming up, and your wealth is about to be inflated away. So let's start with how we got here, because understanding the history explains why this acceleration is inevitable. In 1980, US national debt was $98 billion, under $1 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio was 35%, manageable and sustainable. Then came 40 years of fiscal irresponsibility by both political parties. The 1980s, the Reagan era. Massive military spending increases to win the Cold War. Tax cuts that reduced revenue. Debt surged from $98 billion to $2.8 trillion. The 1990s brought relative stability. The budget briefly balanced under Clinton. Debt rose more slowly, reaching $5.7 trillion by 2000. Then came the 2000s, where everything accelerates. Bush tax cuts. The war on terror. Afghanistan and Iraq costing over $2 trillion. Medicare Part D adding trillions in unfunded liabilities. The financial crisis. $700 billion in TARP bailouts, plus trillions more in Federal Reserve emergency programs. By 2008, US debt had reached $10 trillion. Then came the 2010s, post-financial crisis spending, Obama-era stimulus programs, continued war spending, additional tax cuts, debt climbed from $10 trillion to $23 trillion by 2020. Then came the 2020s, a complete breakdown, COVID emergency spending, over $5 trillion in stimulus, expanded unemployment benefits, PPP loans, direct cash payments, infrastructure bills, student loan forgiveness attempts, more defense spending, debt exploded from $23 trillion in 2020 to $39 trillion by early 2026. But here's what's critical to understand. It's not just the spending, it's the interest rate environment. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were essentially zero. The Federal Reserve held rates between 0% and 0.25% for over a decade. That allowed the US government to borrow trillions at almost no cost. The average interest rate on US debt was around 2%. Then in 2022, inflation surged. The Fed was forced to act aggressively. Rates jumped from 0% to 5.5% in just 18 months, the fastest rate hiking cycle in history. Now, all that debt issued at 0% to 2% is maturing and being refinanced at 4% to 5%. This is why interest expenses are exploding. Let me show you the math so you understand why this becomes a death spiral. Over the next 3 years, $9 trillion in US debt must be refinanced. Old average rate, 2%. New average rate, 4.5%. Old annual interest cost on that debt, $180 billion. New annual interest cost, $405 billion. That's an additional $225 billion per year just from refinancing existing debt. But it gets worse. The US is also borrowing about $2 trillion in new debt every year to cover ongoing deficits. So we're not just rolling over old debt at higher rates, we're adding new debt at high rates. Here's the trajectory for total interest expense. 2024, $1.2 trillion. 2027, $1.8 trillion estimated. 2030, $2.5 trillion projected if rates stay elevated. By 2030, the US could be spending $2.5 trillion per year just on interest. That's 42% of projected federal tax revenue. Not defense, not Social Security, not infrastructure, just interest payments to bondholders. Now let's address the question everyone asks. Can America repay this debt? The answer is no, through conventional means. And here's why, using simple math. To actually pay down debt, a government must run a budget surplus. Revenue has to exceed spending. The excess is used to pay down principal. The United States hasn't run a meaningful budget surplus since 2001. That's 25 years of continuous deficits. Current annual federal revenue, about $4.9 trillion. Current annual federal spending, about $7.2 trillion. That's an annual deficit of $2.3 trillion. We're not even close to balanced, let alone running surpluses to pay down debt. Now, could the US theoretically balance the budget and pay down the debt? Let's look at the numbers. To eliminate the $2.3 trillion annual deficit, the government would need to do one of two things. Option one, cut spending by $2.3 trillion. That's 32% of all federal spending. Here's the problem. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest totals about $4.6 trillion. This spending is legally required. You can't cut it without changing laws. That leaves discretionary spending, defense, education, and everything else like about $1.7 trillion. To close the gap, you would have to cut all discretionary spending to zero and then cut an additional $600 billion from mandatory programs. That means eliminating the entire military, shutting down all federal agencies, and cutting Social Security or Medicare by roughly 20%. That's politically impossible. Option two, raise taxes by $2.3 trillion. That's a 47% increase in total federal revenue. Individual income taxes currently generate about $2.4 trillion. You'd essentially have to double income taxes across the board. Corporate taxes bring in about $500 billion. They'd need to increase by 5 times. Wealth taxes, VAT taxes, every possible tax increase combined still wouldn't reliably close a $2.3 trillion gap without causing massive economic damage. Also politically impossible. So the math is clear. The US cannot balance its budget, let alone run surpluses large enough to pay down $39 trillion in debt. But maybe we could grow our way out. If GDP grows faster than debt, the debt to GDP ratio improves, right? Let's check that math. Current US GDP is about $29 trillion. Current debt to GDP ratio, 134%. For that ratio to improve, GDP growth must exceed debt growth. US GDP grows roughly 2% to 3% per year in real terms. US debt is growing 7% to 10% per year. Debt is growing 3 to 5 times faster than the economy. You cannot grow your way out when GDP grows at 2% and debt grows at 8%. The math doesn't work. The debt to GDP ratio worsens every single year. So if we can't cut spending, can't raise taxes enough, and can't grow fast enough, what are the options? There are only 3 ways this ends. Option 1, default. The US government could refuse to pay bondholders, declare bankruptcy, restructure the debt. This is what Argentina has done repeatedly, what Greece was forced into, what Russia did in 1998. But for the United States, default is nuclear. The dollar is the global reserve currency. US treasuries are considered the safest asset on earth. They are the foundation of the global financial system. If the US defaults, even partially, the dollar immediately loses reserve currency status. Global trade collapses because most international transactions are dollar denominated. US borrowing costs explode to 15%, 20%, or higher. The government can't function, federal employees aren't paid, Social Security checks stop, the military can't operate, financial markets crash globally, your 401k, your pension, everything collapses. This is economic Armageddon. So yes, default is theoretically possible, but practically unthinkable. The damage would be catastrophic. Option 2, austerity. The government could impose massive spending cuts and tax increases, cut Social Security benefits by 30%, cut Medicare by 40%, eliminate most federal agencies, raise income taxes by 50%, slash defense spending by 60%. This is what the IMF forced on Greece, what Europe imposed after the 2008 crisis. But austerity causes economic depression. When you cut government spending and raise taxes at the same time, you drain demand from the economy, unemployment spikes, GDP contracts, and tax revenues fall even further.
You end up in a death spiral where austerity actually makes the debt problem worse, not better. And politically, it's impossible. No elected official who votes for 30% cuts to Social Security is getting reelected. The American public would revolt long before accepting Greek-style austerity. So if default destroys the system and austerity is politically impossible, there's only one option left. Option 3, inflation, print money. The Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars out of thin air and uses them to buy US Treasury bonds. This is called debt monetization, or quantitative easing when they want it to sound technical. Here's how it works. The Treasury needs to borrow $2 trillion, but can't find enough buyers at reasonable interest rates. So the Federal Reserve steps in and announces, we'll buy the $2 trillion in Treasury bonds. The Fed creates $2 trillion digitally. They press a button. The money appears. That newly created money is used to buy bonds from the government. The government gets $2 trillion in cash to spend. The debt is effectively paid with printed money. But what happens when you create trillions of dollars out of nothing? The money supply explodes, more dollars chase the same amount of goods, prices rise. That's inflation, your dollars lose purchasing power, and this is already happening. The Fed's balance sheet, a record of how much money they've printed, grew from $4 trillion in 2019 to nearly $9 trillion at the 2022 peak. They printed $5 trillion in just 3 years, and what happened? Inflation surged to 9%, the highest in 40 years. Prices today are about 20% higher than they were in 2020. Your paycheck buys 20% less. That's the inflation tax, and it's about to get much worse. Now let me show you why the debt is accelerating so fast right now, because once you understand the mechanism, you understand the timeline. We're in what's called a debt spiral. Here's how it works. Year one, the government runs a $2 trillion deficit. They borrow $2 trillion. Total debt rises to $39 trillion. Interest payments climb to $1.2 trillion per year. Year two, the government must pay that $1.2 trillion in interest, but it's already running deficits everywhere else, so it borrows another $2 trillion plus $1.2 trillion just to pay interest. Total new borrowing, $3.2 trillion. Debt rises to $42.2 trillion. Interest payments climb to $1.4 trillion. Year three. Now interest is $1.4 trillion. The government still has to function, so it borrows $3.5 trillion. Debt rises to $45.7 trillion. Interest payments jump to $1.7 trillion. You see the pattern. Interest payments require more borrowing. More borrowing increases the debt. More debt increases future interest payments, which requires even more borrowing. This is a mathematical feedback loop. It compounds, and it accelerates exponentially. Right now, we're adding about $6 billion per day. In 3 years, it becomes $10 billion per day. In 5 years, $15 billion per day. The curve goes vertical, and there's no way to stop it without one of the three options: default, austerity, or inflation. Now let me show you how this destroys economic growth, because this is where it hits the real economy and real people. Economic growth comes from investment and productivity. Businesses invest in factories, equipment, and technology. Workers become more productive. Output rises. But when the government borrows trillions, it crowds out private investment. Here's the mechanism. The government issues $2 trillion in bonds to fund deficits. Who buys them? Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments. Where does that money come from? Savings. A pool of available capital. And the government absorbs $2 trillion to fund consumption. That's $2 trillion not available for businesses to invest and grow. A startup that needed $10 million to build a factory can't get a loan because banks are buying treasury bonds instead. An entrepreneur who wants to expand can't access capital. This is called crowding out. Government borrowing literally steals capital from productive private investment. And it gets worse as interest rates rise. When treasury bonds pay 5%, why would anyone lend to a risky business at 7%? You just buy the risk-free government bond. All capital flows to the government, not businesses, not innovation. The result, lower business investment, slower productivity growth, stagnant wages, slower GDP growth. The economy stagnates, and we're seeing it happen. US productivity growth has been declining for 20 years, real wages stagnant since 2000, GDP growth stuck at 2% instead of historical 3 to 4%. Debt is strangling growth. Now, the impact on regular people, devastating. Impact one, higher taxes. Someone has to pay interest on $39 trillion. That someone is you. Interest payments are $1.2 trillion and rising, projected to $2 trillion. By 2030, 42% of your federal income tax will go purely to pay interest. Not infrastructure, not social security, not defense, just bondholders, many foreign governments, and wealthy investors. You are working to pay interest accumulated before you were born. Impact 2, reduced government services, as interest consumes more of the budget, education funding cuts, infrastructure crumbles, veteran benefits shrink, research disappears, Social Security and Medicare become insolvent. You pay in all your life, but when you retire, the money won't be there. Impact 3, inflation destroys savings. As we discussed, the government will print money to pay bondholders. Your dollars lose value. Savings built over decades shrink. $100,000 today with 10% inflation for 5 years loses roughly half its real value. Impact 4, lower wages, fewer jobs. Government crowding out private investment means businesses can't expand, hire, or raise wages. Unemployment stays high. Workers compete for fewer jobs. Wages stagnate or decline. You work harder, but your paycheck buys less. Impact 5, generational theft. Current generations spend money and pass the bill to future generations. Your children, grandchildren will inherit an economy crushed by debt they didn't create, higher taxes, worse services, fewer opportunities. This is intergenerational theft on a scale never seen before. Now, the timeline of the crisis, 2026 to 2027, now to 18 months, debt grows from $39 trillion to $42 trillion. Interest payments, $1.2 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Market stable, Fed cuts rates slightly, hope for reform. Political dysfunction persists, 2027 to 2028, 18 to 36 months, acceleration phase. Debt crosses $45 trillion, interest payments $1.8 trillion, 32% of federal revenue. A major treasury auction poorly received, yields spike 6% plus Fed resumes QE. First signs of debt monetization, 2028 to 2030, 3 to 5 years crisis phase. Debt approaches $50 trillion, interest greater than $2 trillion per year, 38% plus of revenue. Fed prints $3 trillion plus per year to buy bonds. Inflation spikes 8 to 10%, real wages fall sharply. Social Security and Medicare crises deepen. Political paralysis blocks solutions, markets price and default risk, or currency crisis. 2030 to 2035, 5 to 10 years, restructuring phase. One of 3 outcomes. Dollar loses reserve currency status. Oil trades in yuan or BRICS currency. Major debt restructuring. The chain reaction is unstoppable without radical intervention, and history shows governments rarely choose restraint. International trade starts shifting away from dollars. The US can no longer print money to pay debts. You are then forced into austerity, default, or hyperinflation. The Fed is already printing $5 trillion plus annually to monetize debt. Inflation could spike to 15 to 20% or higher. Currency crisis, capital flight, economic chaos, or international debt restructuring could happen. Global creditors like China and Japan may impose fiscal terms on the US. Partial defaults on debt owed to foreigners could occur. Economic sovereignty may be lost. The exact form is uncertain, but the math guarantees one of these outcomes within 10 years. Debt cannot keep growing 8 to 10% per year while the economy grows 2%. The gap will close, and when it does, it will be violent. So what do? How do you protect yourself when your government is destroying the currency? First, accept that inflation is the chosen path. Default destroys credibility. Austerity is politically impossible. They will inflate. Defense strategy, position for inflation, own hard assets that can't be inflated away, physical gold and silver, real estate and strong markets, commodities and commodity-producing equities, Bitcoin and scarce digital assets, international assets outside the dollar system. These maintain or increase value as the dollar loses purchasing power. Second, minimize exposure to dollar-denominated fixed income. Bonds, especially long-term, get destroyed by inflation. Cash loses purchasing power. A 10-year treasury paying 4.5% with 8% inflation leads to losing 3.5% per year in real terms. Third, eliminate high interest or variable debt. Inflation helps borrowers with fixed low-rate debt, for example, a 30-year mortgage at 3% in 10% inflation. But credit cards and adjustable loans destroy wealth. Pay them off immediately. Fourth, invest in skills and education that cannot be inflated away. Medical, engineering, skilled trades, anything that creates real value. A doctor's ability to heal or a plumber's ability to fix pipes cannot be inflated away. Fifth, build resilience and self-sufficiency. Supply chains will break, store food, water, essentials, have backup plans and community networks. Those fully dependent on fragile systems suffer most. Brutal truth, the US has $39 trillion in debt, mathematically impossible to repay. Debt grows 8% per year, economy grows 2%. Interest payments are consuming an ever larger share of the budget. Within 5 years, the government may spend more on interest than defense. Within 10 years, interest could consume 50% of all revenue. No political will exists to cut spending or raise taxes enough. Neither party is serious about fiscal responsibility. They will keep borrowing until the system breaks. The system will break, the only question. Default to unlikely austerity to politically impossible, inflation to guaranteed. They will print money, they will inflate the debt away. Your savings and the dollar's purchasing power are the target. This isn't speculation, this is math. The debt spiral is underway, Fed printed $5 trillion in 3 years, inflation hit 9%, cost of living up 20% since 2020, and it's only the beginning. The real crisis comes when debt crosses $50 trillion, interest payments hit $2.5 trillion annually, Fed prints $3 to $5 trillion per year, inflation runs 10 to 20%, dollar loses reserve currency status, timeline 5 to 10 years. You have a window now to move out of dollar-denominated paper assets, own hard, productive, and international assets, eliminate bad debt, invest in skills that survive inflation. Most will do nothing, trust the system, hold cash and bonds, and watch wealth evaporate. The 5% who understand will protect themselves. They'll preserve wealth through the crisis. Which group will you be in? If this video showed you the mathematical reality of America's debt crisis, subscribe now, turn on notifications. The next video will show which assets perform best during currency debasement, how to build an inflation-resistant portfolio. You need to see it before the crisis accelerates. $39 trillion debt cannot be repaid. Printing presses are warming up. Your wealth is the target. The math is clear. The timeline is 5 to 10 years.